All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am Kim Green, Executive Director of Advanced CTE, and we are going to let you all get a minute to populate the meeting room, which I see folks coming in, and we will get started when we have kind of a good, where the numbers are starting to slow down with the population of the meeting room. I feel like this. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're going to let everybody join our meeting room before we're going to get started, and we'll get going in just a minute. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kim Green, Executive Director of Advanced CTE, and I am grateful to you for spending a little bit of your day with us, and grateful to our guests for what I know will be a great conversation. A couple of months ago, I had a conversation with Assistant Secretary Dr. Amy Lloyd, and this is kind of the second in a series of more of conversations with colleagues and friends who have been working in the federal policy space for a long time. Folks who are leading organizations that do work that impact CTE and career pathways. And so I'm delighted to have them joining us today. Of course, as always, we want to make sure that you're getting out of this what you want. So please be sure to put questions in the chat throughout the conversation, and we'll make sure that we have time at the end or throughout, depending on where it fits best within our conversation, to answer those questions. As I mentioned, I'm delighted to have two folks who I consider friends and longtime colleagues with us today, Maria Flynn, who is the President and CEO of JFF, and Andy Van Kleunen, who is the CEO of the National Skills Coalition. And I've asked them to join me in a conversation of looking at the election, but also kind of the federal policy space, and reflecting a bit on our past to get to where we're at, and maybe looking a bit in our crystal ball about what we think is ahead for us. So we're going to talk today with each one of them in that conversation. So first, I want to have Maria share a little bit about JFF, what the organization does, its scope and its mission, and how that impacts CTE for those who aren't familiar with your work.
Great. Thanks so much, Kim. It's wonderful to be here, and great to be here with Andy, who I have known for a long time. We've been at this together for quite a while. So JFF is a national nonprofit whose mission is to drive economic advancement for all. And we do that both through policy work and programmatic work. So we really focus on programmatic informed policy, both at the state and the federal level. And our work is really a combination of design work, so designing new models, scaling what works, influencing both through policy work, thought leadership and convening, and then investing. So we do a lot of re-granting. We also have a small impact investing fund that we launched a few years ago called JFF Ventures. So we do work around the country, and CTE really touches our work in a number of different ways, both through our Pathways to Prosperity initiative, which Dr. Amy Lloyd led for us for probably about a decade, to our community college work, to our work with workforce boards. So it's really a theme that cuts across almost all of JFF's work.
Great, thank you. And Andy, how about the National Skills Coalition? What's the scope of the work that you all do?
Thanks, Kim. And yes, it's great to be on here with Maria as well. When I think about our origin story, like Maria and I really kind of started coming up together on either sides of policy conversations. What National Skills Coalition is trying to change the rules for who gets a chance to succeed in this country, and particularly how we think about our public education and training investments, changing the narrative about how this country thinks about skilled work and skilled workers, and really recognizing that we need to be investing in folks at all levels of the labor market so that they have a better chance to succeed and develop skilled careers. And so that we're doing that in a way that's engaging the local business community, so they have an opportunity to both shape how it is that we're training and educating people, but also then they're committing to hiring and advance those folks over time through career pathways. And we do that. We bring together a range of different stakeholders, so business and labor leaders, community colleges and community organizations, workforce boards, workforce intermediaries, anti-poverty advocates, all who kind of believe in this mission and feels that if we kind of paid attention to what folks are doing effectively on the ground and helping workers and businesses succeed, that should be driving the policy conversations that we're having both in Washington, D.C., as well as in states around the country. And so we get a chance to bring a lot of those stakeholders to Washington on a fairly regular basis to have conversations with the administration, whoever's in charge at the time, as well as both sides of the aisle in Congress. And then we work in about 20 different states around the country to try to advance some of those issues as well, both through advocacy and some technical assistance work.
And I was going to ask that question, kind of what's your footprint? I know you're both, well, National Skills Coalition is a DC kind of headquartered organization. JFF is headquartered in Boston, but you both have national footprints, right?
Yes, so for JFF, we have 3 physical offices, Boston, DC, and Oakland, California, but do work in pretty much every state.
Mm-hmm.
And Andy, you said 20 states you're working in, and you've got staff across the country. I think as we all
have, yes, we are the hybrid. We were the hybrid organization before it was cool to be a hybrid organization or placeless organization, at least. So about half of our staff are based in DC, and the rest of them are based around the country. We have 2 different state networks. We have a skills span network of state coalitions that look a lot like our national coalition that are doing this work, and then we have a set of we have a project called Business Leaders United, which is small and medium-sized business leaders. And they are operating in about 14 different states around the country, but we do work in other parts of this, other states as well.
That's great. And I am very grateful that both of your organizations are such great partners of ours. You both signed on to the CTE Without Limits vision. And I hope that one of the things that people take away from today's webinar is that there is more than enough work for all of us to go around. Each of our organizations is working in a space that is common, but we all have our own strengths and our own specific stakeholders that we partner best with, but we also borrow and collaborate with one another to best serve the needs of our communities. And we hope to see that at the state and local level as well. So I want to shift now to kind of your stories as individuals and leaders. And Maria, I'm going to start with you. Can you share kind of how and why you got into this policy related work? I'll start there.
Sure. So I very much grew up around it. So my mother, when I was in 4th grade, decided to re-enter the labor force and took a job as the school secretary for our local small CTE high school, or vocational school as we called it back then. And so we lived in a rural area in New Jersey. And I would go to school with her every day to her school before my school started. And so for many years, you know, I was in a CTE high school every day, every morning, and got to know the students and the teachers and the administrators. And it really has, you know, just always left a huge mark on me. And meanwhile, my father spent most of his career at the New Jersey Department of Labor. So coming at this from the workforce side of things, working on registered apprenticeship and other things back through the 80s and 90s. So this is what I heard every day growing up. Mm-hmm. I started at the U.S. Department of Labor right after getting out of school. That's when I first met Andy. I remember Andy would bring in groups of folks to talk with us. I was there through 3 different administrations as a career person. Left the senior executive service to go to JFF about 15 years ago because I felt that kind of regardless of who is in power, in my opinion, it's hard to drive innovation from within the bureaucracy. And thought that JFF would be a great place to try to drive a more innovative agenda and influence policymakers more from the outside. So I've been there for 15 years and I have been CEO for about 6 of those, but have really spent my whole life at this career at this intersection of education and workforce, whether that was through the School to Work initiative back in the Kleunen era or the first WIA in the late 90s, but have just always been focused on these issues.
It's funny, we all talk about occupational identity and what we're exposed to, right, matters. And you are a perfect example of that, right? So Andy, how about you? How did you get your start in this space?
Yeah, Maria and I, probably our first conversation was about WIA, like when after it just passed back in the late 90s. I started this work kind of on the practitioner side. So I was working with an organization or a set of organizations that was trying to train folks to create better jobs in the healthcare industry and to kind of create some pathways for advancement there. And then, saw two things happen during the 90s in terms of policy. One was welfare policy decided that we were not going to train low-income folks for jobs anymore. And then even when WIA passed, it seemed like training was not going to be a priority in terms of how that system was operating as well. We'd also had huge cuts in youth workforce development during that period of time. And there was real resistance to even making higher education or kind of building the ability of colleges, and particularly community colleges, to kind of provide some employment support and technical training as part of their mission as well. And so I think that our decision was, boy, if we took the folks who are actually doing the work on the ground and actually could kind of bring them into this policy conversation, wouldn't that be interesting? Because then you would really be learning from practitioners. So that's basically how our organization got started back in the year 2000. It was called the Workforce Alliance at the time, and it's now called the National Skills Coalition. And, and I've continued to do that work in part because I just love to be able to create opportunities for people who really know how policies impact the programming that you're doing to kind of bring that to the attention of policymakers. I'm really inspired by that and really inspired by the work that folks are doing on the ground, including a lot of the folks around this call today. And because I do actually think that there's a fair amount of support, certainly in the American public, but also on either sides of the aisle for the work that we do. The challenge is getting them to agree on how it is that government policies could be expanding that work and investing in what's work and really scaling it in a way that I think is the working folks in this country deserve. And I just think that we've kind of underplayed that for way too long. So that's an ongoing work that both Maria and I have been working on for a number of years. And I think we're in a different position now, but it's a long way to go till we get it to the point where we want it to be.
Yeah, and I was going to add, so my dad was a truck driver. He was a member of the Teamsters. My mom worked in an office, and I had this aspiration of becoming a labor lawyer and went to Cornell, studied industrial and labor relations, got an internship that worked on Senator Simon's Career Pathways Bill, which was the precursor to the School to Work Opportunities Act. And when President Clinton was elected, I was like, well, this thing that was a theory is now becoming law. I'm going to stick with it and start to do government relations work, and have kind of stuck with it. But at the heart of it was me seeing my parents, who were lower class, kind of blue collar workers who struggled their whole lives, and thinking about how do we use education and workforce to be able to break cycles of poverty. And as a family who was on LIHEAP and used food stamps, knowing the value of the federal support system was important to me, and continues to be important of how we help others have that hand up that they need. And so I want to use that as a launch pad to, like I mentioned, the School to Work Opportunities Act. Each one of us, I think, mentioned that in some way, shape, or form. And the federal policy environment then was different, right? I mean, I remember very clearly two sides of the aisle coming together and banding together around the advocacy of an initiative, and not just immediately squashing the president's 100-day initiatives. So I'm wondering, from your perspectives, how has the federal policy environment changed over your careers, and how are we doing in terms of our ability, or what's most effective to influence policy to achieve the goals that each of our organizations is striving toward? And whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, Andy, why don't you start?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, to your point, Kim, right? I mean, there was a period of time during the 80s and the 90s where it was a question of scale in terms of where it is Republicans and Democrats were going to come together on some of these issues. There was something that kind of happened in the 90s where there started to be kind of a partisan divide on that. And then what eventually happened, by the time I kind of came on the scene in the late 90s, I think there was actually skepticism on both sides of the aisle, right? There were some folks, mostly folks on the Republican side, who kind of felt like government's job was not to intervene, certainly not in employment policy or labor market policy. And to the extent that education and training was part of that, they weren't really clear that the government should be doing much at all on that anymore. And there were Democrats who had kind of championed some of these programs for years, who felt like they weren't being very effective. And so they both kind of walked away from them. And I think welfare reform and Workforce Investment Act were kind of two demonstrations of that. And I feel that over time, what it's been has been trying to kind of rebuild some of that bipartisan interest in the issue, at least and we're talking about federal government. I mean, certainly at the state level, things play out differently, but at the federal government level, I think that, 10, 12 years ago, I think we actually started to see that. Like we've had, 3 different presidential races where there's at least been a candidate who has talked about these issues, which was not the case during the early aughts for sure. And I think that there was a period of time where we had real bipartisan agreement that there's something should be done, that yes, not everybody has to go to a degree program. There's a lot of jobs that are going unfilled out there for which we'd be investing in the education training of a range of folks who we currently are ignoring with a lot of our policies, or at least not investing in them at the level that we think is appropriate. It was just kind of them getting on the same page. And there was a period of time we had a lot of bipartisan legislation around that. The dynamics now are a little bit different. Sometimes having a bipartisan piece of legislation actually does not necessarily win you favor with the other members of your caucus. Sometimes there's more interest in just a Republican-only sponsored bill or a Democrat-sponsored bill, and that's not just about our stuff. That's about a lot of different things. But I do feel like it doesn't change the fact that there's a lot of folks that feel something should be done, and it's just a matter of how it is that you can advance that in a way and make it seem important enough that when people start to snipe from the extreme ends of either caucus, that they're willing to kind of hold the ground and actually move some things forward.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that the days of like bipartisanship are ones that I remember dearly and wish we could get back to. And even remembering the negotiations around the WIA back in the late 90s, very clearly remembering on the Senate side with Senators Kennedy and Wellstone, Enzi and DeWine, that really rallied together like very collaboratively to kind of get this done. And I like when I think back on those years, to me, there were always the kind of dividing lines that you could like anticipate, state versus local power, or differences in like how to approach governance structures, or different thoughts on like funding levels, or things that you could kind of anticipate and navigate your way through policy conversations. And now I just feel like it's, as we're seeing across issues, in America in general, right, just a lot more kind of strident views on both sides and not a lot of willingness to kind of come together and work it through. And I think that worries me, because to me, like, if you can't have a bipartisan approach around jobs, like, then kind of like what else is there almost? I kind of like, of course, I'm a little biased given my background, but I also think that given we've seen, to me, what's almost a change in legislative strategy with, just less bills like going through Congress and more of these, large scale legislative agreements and so forth, it almost like changes or reduces the venues that there really are to have some of these conversations. So I feel we would benefit greatly just from having more of the deeper conversations about the issues. And instead, it's, hoping to get some workforce language in the CHIPS Act, right? And trying to squeeze something in, among a much larger conversation. And so I think it just changes the strategy to one that's more challenging.
Yeah, I was thinking about when Congress actually used to do the reauthorizations in order, sort of on time, right? I mean, how overdue are we on the WIOA reauthorizations at 12 years? So, I mean, it seems like, I feel like less gets done than we used to. And the process, right, of actually like having hearings as a learning moment to inform legislation, and then kind of the dynamic of people going back and forth and editing and stuff, that happens sometimes, but not kind of as systemically as it did historically. And I feel like that is a kind of missed opportunity for contribution and perspectives to be added into kind of these bills. Although I do think that the CTE workforce space probably is, as much as we decry kind of the bipartisanship not being as prevalent as it used to, we are some of the last bastions that it actually does exist in this space, which is nice. And one of the things that I know is often kind of at the heart of some of these issues, more on the education side, maybe less on workforce development side, is the appropriate federal role. Now, we all, I'm sure, have heard by now that Rand Paul has not chosen to be in a leadership position on the Help Committee, and he's often decried not having a federal role in a lot of these issues. So I'm wondering, kind of from your perspective, what do you view as the appropriate federal role in our collective space of CTE, pathways, workforce development, and maybe what is most important, or that the federal role should be doing in these spaces?
Marie, you want to go?
Sure. So I think, one is, maybe starting with the bully pulpit, right? And really having the feds having unified messages around the roles of these programs, how they can better align and work together. I think we've seen some things coming out of the Biden administration over the past couple of weeks. I think that's definitely great steps in that direction. I think there's also a role in incentivizing action in states. So could you, be putting more money out that's encouraging more coordination and deeper alignment of CTE and other programs. And I think, to me, something that's missing in the kind of landscape right now is investing in innovation and learning from that innovation. Because I would argue, even in the Obama years where there was a lot of money that was put into workforce innovation grants and so forth, that I feel the field didn't really learn everything that they could have coming out of those investments. So government really having a strong R&D role, in a sense, of helping to lead the field. So those are, I'm sure Andy has lots of other thoughts.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree on the R&D thing, but then the research is then supposed to yield a set of conclusions that then should drive some change, right? And I agree with you on this, that, and in part because these things are also underfunded, that R&D funding is really just going to kind of get people to the point where they can do the basic work that they wanted to do. And we've not seen this, but wait, there's actually some innovation there. We obviously have picked grantees that are good at what they're doing, or at least have put together some good proposals, but then let's let that drive how it is we think about the next WIO legislation, or the next HEA legislation, or the next Perkins legislation. And I feel like that gets lost, as that translation does get lost. Because I do agree that you're absolutely right. The federal government should be kind of an R&D, what's the next thing out there, and let's give people some extra resources to do something extra beyond what we're already asking them to do to kind of test some of these new things. I mean, I will say, Kimberly, as you were talking about things around bipartisan agreement around Perkins, right? It wasn't about Perkins that stopped Perkins from getting reauthorized. It was because of philosophical issues about whether or not the federal government should have a role in education policy at all, right? And what the authority was of the Secretary of Education and all of that kind of stuff. It was not about the actual work of career and technical education in high schools and colleges that stopped it from getting moved forward. I mean, one thing I think is probably not an appropriate role for the federal government to play is, this thing about picking winners. I mean, I do feel like the federal government should be both investing in innovation and building capacity then for folks on the ground to figure out what's going to work for a particular industry in a particular labor market. And with some expectation that a range of different perspectives are going to be brought together in figuring that stuff out. So obviously folks probably know that we're huge advocates for sector partnerships or industry partnerships as kind of like a front end part of how it is that we build that capacity with public dollars at the local level, not to make the decisions for folks about what they're working out, but to give them the capacity and to make sure that all of the perspectives that we think need to be there, unions, multiple businesses, community colleges, high schools, workforce boards, other local leaders that need to be part of the conversation, that we're creating a capacity for that to happen. So we're problem solving for that industry, not just to fill immediate needs that companies have to fill positions, but we're developing a plan for how we're going to grow this industry in the future by investing in folks here in this community. I mean, I think we made some mistakes back during the Recovery Act around 2010. I think we picked things like green jobs, whether or not there was a labor market there. I think what's different now is, and I think the real opportunity we have is the decisions that are being made about where this administration is making some big bets. They know that it's going to create employment opportunities, but it's because we have particular problems we're trying to solve. We have a healthcare crisis in this country. We have an infrastructure crisis in this country. We have a climate crisis in this country, and we're putting big bets on how it is that we're going to try to do that. But now we also recognize that you can't just solve it by investing in bricks and mortar and things like that. Like we actually need to have a workforce and education strategy that goes along with it. I think the challenge for us is to make sure that that actually happens on the local level. But I think that's the appropriate role. The federal government needs to make sure the resources there and the capacity is there for folks to work together on these issues. And then it's up to folks on the ground to actually deliver. That's really where that should happen.
Yeah, there's a question later that I'll ask you both about like waving your magic wand. And I guess for me, like the challenge is, and the opportunity is, like the federal government should be playing the long game. And I think we play a short game all the time, right? Of like, we're on these cycles of success has to be shown within the electoral cycle. And the challenges we're talking about are ones that require persistence of investment and commitment, more than a 4-year cycle or even an eight-year cycle. And I don't know how we break that, but I know from the work that I've seen in states where you've got consistent leadership, that makes a difference, where you've got consistent investment, that makes a difference. So I don't know. I mean, I know we're not rewriting the Constitution here, but the long game matters. And I think back to like Virginia, that they have a new governor every year, but yet somehow they've stayed the course with a lot of work with regard to pathways and sector strategies. So shout out to Virginia. All right. So I want to shift gears a little bit. We talked about Perkins and WIOA. Both of them have been in the implementation phase. WIOA longer than Perkins, although Perkins is coming up on the kind of endish of its first 4-year state plan, which is kind of hard to believe. So I'm wondering, as folks who interact with these pieces of legislation in different ways, what do you think will be the lasting legacies of WIOA and Perkins 5? What are the bright spots and maybe not so bright spots? And I'll pause there before I ask kind of what you're thinking about for future reauthorization. So lasting legacies, bright spots, not so bright spots, WIOA and Perkins.
You want to go, Maria?
So why don't you start?
All right. Well, I mean, I'll at least start with WIOA. I mean, I think the WIOA legislation that was passed in 2014, I think made some important steps forward that finally started to listen to folks in the field about kind of like, here are the things that we actually think work. We think sector partnerships are important. We think that career pathways and looking at multiple interventions in folks' education and training while they're working over time is important. We think it's important that we should try to make it easier for career and tech ed programs and workforce development programs and adult education programs and support services programs out of TANF and SNAP-E&T to work more effectively together. I think all of those things were the absolute right intentions. I think in terms of what we've actually delivered on that, it's been pretty uneven. It's not that you wouldn't expect that. It's a highly underinvested system compared to what it is that we're asking it to do. And it is, just obviously coming out of this latest, post-pandemic recession, whatever, like it's called to do a lot of different things, some of which they probably could have done in calmer times with more resources, some of which I think is still very challenging to do. I mean, I think that the interagency cooperation, like we're seeing some of that now at the federal level, but there's a lot of things that make that very hard to do at the state level. I feel like when there's emergencies, we somehow figure out how to kind of like waive all of those things and then folks can work very effectively together. But once the crisis dies down, we kind of go back to kind of what the institutional expectations are of each of these different programs. And I don't think WIOA nearly delivered on that. As a matter of fact, I don't know if we've moved the needle much at all on that, and except in places that we're already doing some of that stuff already. But I think what it has done, it has at least one attention. I think it actually, what was written into WIOA has influenced what the Biden administration has put into things like Build Back Better and there are various other things that they're doing. So I think it's influential in terms of the issues that it's lifted up. I think as a piece of legislation, though, it needs a lot more oomph to kind of move things across. And the other thing too, I just think, just to say it, it needs to train more people. It needs to train more people, and it needs to recognize that it's not just an extension of the unemployment system. We're not just training people who don't have jobs. We should be really investing in training people who do have jobs, but not great jobs that they want to advance in over time. And it just does not do that very well at all. And that's an ongoing frustration to the employer community, who is ready to advocate for it, but wants to know that it can also help folks advance within industry as well as bring new people into the industry.
Yep. Yeah, I think those are great points, and I can pick up where Andy left off. So I think that, I love the idea of building a system that can also really help advance those who are underemployed, right? Because I think that's a huge gap in our federal system at the moment, and very much kind of out of line with the labor market reality that we're in right now. So definitely agree with that. I think a lot, thinking about WIOA and WIA, before that, thinking back to 1997 or whatever it was, when I was at DOL and we were negotiating with Congress, we didn't even have the technology to, email them, right? We were literally faxing pages back and forth, or I, as the junior staffer, was walking things up to the Senate, right? And so if you think we're operating in a system that was designed in a different era, right? We were thinking about, bricks and mortar centers and things like that. And while there were, America's Job Bank was something that was bright and new, I think we would be well served to really take a step back and say, if we were to design a talent system for this country for today and for 50 years in the future, what would that really look like? And what is, how would we want services to be delivered? How would we ensure folks know what quality training providers are out there and who's available to them? I think the eligible training provider system is one that needs, a lot of rethinking and redesign. How do we kind of bring together conversations about the ETPL and, the expansion of Pell for shorter term credentials? What are we trying to do as a nation around access to high quality programs that are not degrees, right? So I think the more we can have bigger conversations where we step back from the kind of day-to-day details and say, how are we designing for the future, and how are we doing that in a way that really implements, a future-looking equitable system, I think is what we're missing. I think too much we're, just kind of making little tweaks around the edges and not thinking enough about those fundamental changes. And I would say on the CTE side, I think there's an opportunity to really continue to paint the picture of how does CTE, how do Perkins funds fit into these broader conversations about career pathways and career connected learning. And so I think sometimes the field still thinks about things in siloed ways. And so, how can we really start to paint the picture of, what does a very comprehensive and aligned system look like, and how does that at the end of the day benefit workers and learners?
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on the Perkins stuff, I mean, I do think, to the extent that people seem to be fully committed to this idea that career and technical education is truly a pathway, that there is both a high school and a college component, so long as we're making sure that you can enter at either place, I think that that's really important. And I think that, kind of the role that high schools and colleges have played in kind of the apprenticeship boom, I think, Perkins allowed actually high schools and colleges to probably play a much more formative role than they probably would have had an opportunity to in the past. Again, not where we want it to be, but at least I feel like we're on the right track on a lot of that stuff. I mean, if we had passed free community college, the reality is that unless that was all going to go to transfer students, there's an underinvested career and technical education aspect of free community college that was not going to be solved by what was written in to Build Back Better. And so I do feel that, to the extent that there is any popular interest in what we could have gotten from free community college, I do feel like the CTE system, and because governors are going to their CTE systems now, they are desperate to try to figure out how to get folks back into the labor market, how to prepare for all of these infrastructure investments. So I do feel like there's a ton of interest in how to scale that system. I think the current structure, certainly the current funding levels of Perkins is not sufficient to do it. But I think there's a lot of things that we still need to do on it to actually, I think people have greater expectations now about what it could do. And I think we need to have a law that actually kind of matches those expectations.
Yeah, I mean, something knitting together what you've both said, I mean, we all know that reauthorizations are kind of impacted by the context that they grow up in, and those contexts are different. And so, and yet we expect all these pieces of legislation to work seamlessly with one another. And I would love to have, and I know this is impossible because the same committee staff are working on these bills, but let's sit down and put HEA and WIOA and Perkins and ESSA and IDEA on the table all at once and figure out, how do these systems actually align? Let's not have duplication, but making sure we're centering learners in each one of them, not the adults that are in the system, meaning the adults that work in the system, not the adults that are served by the system. But I know that is not likely and probably feels threatening to a lot of people because they're like, oh my God, block grants of the night. And I'm not talking about block grants. I'm just talking about thoughtful policy alignment, which the way we do it doesn't actually allow for that, because you're just connecting. I mean, Perkins 4 really was a reflection of No Child Left Behind reauthorization. Perkins 5 was a reflection of WIOA reauthorization, and has been around for over 100 years with the Smith-Hughes Act. So we just keep adding to it and never actually having that thoughtful kind of policy analysis, Maria, that you talked about. So maybe before we retire, we can.
That's right.
Bring them all together and figure it out. Meanwhile, we've got these stable of ongoing pieces of legislation. We've also seen a lot of new investment and policy kind of enacted in the last couple of years. We've got the infrastructure bill. Maria, you mentioned CHIPS. We had the American Rescue Plan. So all of them were about the health of our country, economic stability and mobility. And I'm wondering, there's still money on the table in a lot of states. So wondering from your perspective, what are the opportunities or maybe missed opportunities that states in particular can or should be paying attention to and trying to take advantage of before the resources are either rescinded or sunset? So Maria, you want to go first on this one?
Sure. I just think there's so many opportunities. I feel these are unprecedented levels of funding that are flowing in some cases, and many of which have the potential to have a very strong, CTE or workforce component. Sometimes that's not as obvious as it could be, but those opportunities are there. I think one initiative that we're excited about is JFF and Advanced CTE are 2 of 5 organizations, I believe, that have come together, or we're called the Launch Coalition, that's really working with states and communities to maximize their use of COVID relief dollars around quality pathways. So I think that's going to be a way to really help states and regions look at what's available. I think that the money that has come out already through Commerce, either through the Build Back Better Regional Challenge or the Good Jobs Challenge, huge opportunities there, as Andy said earlier, around sector strategies and career pathways and so forth. And then, looking to see what Commerce is going to be investing in to support the semiconductor industry with the CHIPS Act funding, I think will be yet another really interesting workforce opportunity. So I think what I worry about is that, sometimes some of the partnerships that are going after these various opportunities may not always be bringing in, the CTE stakeholders or the workforce stakeholders or folks who are, maybe already underway with some of these efforts in their area. So I think the more that those groups can, push their way to the table if they're not already there, will be important. Because I think one of the things that I worry most about is duplication of effort, or not kind of building upon good things that are already happening. And I think in the given the timeframes and the amounts of money, making sure those strategic connections are made is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I'd +1 on the effort to try to get American Rescue Plan dollars and other dollars that are still sitting in the states on the ground as quickly as possible. I mean, the time for rescue is long past us. We should have been investing in the recovery last year, but here we are. So, and I think that there's new urgency, and now as states and localities are really coming to terms with what it's going to require to actually implement the bipartisan infrastructure law and the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And like, these are huge opportunities, and we cannot wait until we start putting shovels in the ground to start figuring out like, oh, where are the folks going to come from to actually help build these projects, right? So we should be taking every available dollar. There's both the plus and the minus of the rescue plan dollars. They were very flexible. It allowed, again, for things to be funded very quickly, but it's also allowed states to hang on to them for too long, in my estimation. So let's try to get as many of them on the ground as we can. What's left to try to prepare people for these new jobs that are going to be created, so that by next year, when we actually start to implement some of this stuff, we have a diverse set of folks from local communities who have been prepared, who've gone through pre-apprenticeships and other kinds of training, that they're in an industry-sponsored training program where they are ready to start being part of the rebuilding of this country. I think it's absolutely essential. And we in the career and tech ed and workforce world, we know that these are not quick processes. Like, we need to be investing in this now, but we need to be very loud about that at the state and local level to kind of make that known. It's not just the agency people, it's not just the education and workforce agency folks that want to be at the table. The practitioners and the advocates who see that this is a key part of their community's future need to be kind of making that point. It's not just about where we're citing projects, but who's going to be involved in the building of them. And that means training them now so they're in the position to do that.
Yeah. And, I think also, thinking about, again, that long game, short game, we all also saw the NAEP data, right, of the learning loss that's happened in our K-12 system, and thinking about, yes, we have to attend to that. And we have to attend to the adults in the system who need reskilling, upskilling to help fill it. And we can't pit one against the other, which often happens in funding conversations. So I want to turn, we've got some questions coming in, but I want to turn to the election a little bit. So, and we were saying before we joined, we didn't know how it was going to turn out or where we were going to be at when we posted this webinar's announcement, but here we are, and we're starting to see the ship steadying in terms of kind of where things are landing. So I just kind of want to give you each an opportunity to just kind of share. So what are you feeling about the election? Any surprises? Did we end up where we thought we would? And kind of just what are your reflections? Andy, you want to start?
Yeah, I'd be shocked if anybody thought we wound up where we thought we were going to. I'll buy that person a beer. That'd be pretty impressive, because I don't think there's that many folks who thought we would be where we are. I think, but that's just in kind of terms of the electoral count, certainly within the Senate and the House as well. I think that, but if you're looking at it from the perspective of our issues, so I'm still not sure what to think. I would like to, because I believe that there's potential for us to be working in a bipartisan fashion on these issues. I would like to believe that one of the takeaways from this electoral cycle would be that there is more interest in kind of moderation and work in the middle than one might have thought from all of the rhetoric that was happening over the past year and a half leading up to this election. And I would hope that that would create, not that there aren't already alliances within Congress to work on these things, but I hope it would kind of mute some of the noise that's been coming from the extremes of the party in terms of stopping people from working together on these issues. So that's what I would like to believe. I do know that, but given that, we're going to see how that works out. There's a lot of other kind of stuff that happens in Congress that has nothing to do with reality or what folks want to see. And so I think that's not what's going to go on. I think at the state level, since a lot of the folks that are tuning in today are working at the state level, like at the ground level, I'm not saying politics are not important. They're extremely important, but there's a lot more need to just solve problems. And there's still a lot of problems with this economy, whether it's going into recession or not, whether or not we're going to be able to take full advantage of those federal investments that are coming in. And so I'm going to assume that there's a lot of room for that work to move forward. I know we're getting calls from both Republican-controlled states and Democratic-controlled states, all asking the same questions and all looking to the same types of solutions and just trying to figure out how to scale them and make them most effective. So I think I take that as there's just an urgency on the ground that I think is going to be irrespective of party. We'll see how things work out at the federal level.
Yep, that all sounds right to me. I would just underscore something that was said earlier, just about that CTE and Perkins, continue to have a lot of bipartisan support. JFF and American Student Assistance recently released some results of a survey that we did of policymakers that really underscored that, like a ton of bipartisan support for this idea of high quality pathways that are alternatives to traditional degrees. So, I like to think that we have a moment in time to press into that a bit more and really kind of see, what more can be done at the federal policy level around that, as well as the state level. I also, think in this, next year or so, like, will we see, the administration negotiating, a bit more with Republicans, particularly on the Senate side? Like, I think, as Andy was saying, like, does this give us, some more opportunity for bipartisan collaboration and momentum? And then I think it'll also be interesting to see, like, what the administration decides to do around, administrative authority. So, like, what gets done through rulemaking or executive order or use of discretionary dollars to put forward their priorities. So I think it's going to be an interesting time for sure.
Yeah. Well, get out your crystal balls, because we have a number of pieces of legislation that have been considered by Congress, but not crossing the finish line. So I want you to kind of, I'm not going to hold you accountable to this, but your best guess of whether or not you think we're going to go get these across the finish line. I'm thinking about higher ed reauthorization, WIOA reauthorization, and we mentioned already earlier kind of short-term Pell or the Jobs Act. So anybody want to take a bet on kind of any of those moving through in this next session of Congress?
I mean, I can at least describe the conditions, whether I'm ready to bet on what comes out of it. Sure. I mean, the thing that is going to happen, well, so, and this kind of gets into the sausage making about who's going to be chair and ranking member of the Education and Labor Committee in the House and the Health Committee in the Senate. I mean, we know in the Senate, it's going to be all new leadership, right? So, because Patty Murray is moving into appropriations. And so we suspect it's going to be Senator Sanders. And to your point, Kim, Senator Paul is not going to be taking the ranking member position. So we think it's going to be Senator Cassidy. So it's not like these are folks who don't know these issues, but it's a new leadership. They're going to have to figure some of those things out. On the House side, if Congresswoman Fox gets her waiver to stay as chair, which generally that she would have been term limited out, she and Congressman Scott are just basically flipping positions. So, the House Democrats passed a WIOA bill last year out of committee. The House Republicans had a bunch of counter bills that they kind of like put out there. And I think that stuff is just going to start to hit the ground running again in the beginning of next Congress. I think on the Senate side, I think they're going to just kind of be figuring out like what it is that they want to prioritize in the context of WIOA and HEA. So I think it's going to be a little bit slower. The only other thing I would offer on the Jobs Act, and actually I'm glad you brought it up because I want to give folks an opportunity. The impact of the election is that the four lead sponsors of that legislation on the House side, Congressman Gonzalez and Congressman Levin, and on the Senate side, Senator Portman and Senator Kane, 3 of the 4 of them will not be in Congress next year. And we are working, and I'm sure JFF and others are working kind of find like who are the new folks that are going to work with Senator Kane to kind of move this forward into the next Congress. But for those 3 departing senators, members of Congress, like there still is a chance that we could get it onto one of the last trains heading out of the station here for this Congress. And so we want to make sure that we make that that we're going to be putting out a call to action. And I hope that folks who are listening to this will kind of, because I do think there are some opportunities that we still could, for those 3 departing members of Congress, this is really a priority for them, working with Senator Kane, that we might still be able to get that across the finish line. So I hope we can take our best shot here in this Congress before we start to figure out who the new team is that's going to take it over in the next one.
Yep. Sometimes the lame duck session is when we can get a lot of work done. So that would be great. Maria, any thoughts on to add to Andy's?
Yeah, well, I surely would, love to see what you're saying about the Jobs Act be true, right? And I would actually, of the 3, I don't know, maybe give that the highest probability of happening. I would put WIOA reauthorization like slightly more likely, but still not overly likely, but a little more so than HEA. I think my worry would be that if a bill did get passed, it may not be as like, reform minded as maybe we want to see, right? So it's like, it might get passed, but is it, would it be the bill that we really want, or a watered down version? And then I just think HEA is going to be hard to get traction, but who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the student loan forgiveness has taken a lot of oxygen out of the room when it comes to higher ed policy. So I think you can anticipate there's going to be a lot of action in the House trying to kind of tear that down, and the administration obviously trying to kind of keep it alive. And so I think that there's going to be so much around that, it's going to be hard to see where HEA reauthorization is going to kind of break through on some of that for a period of time.
Well, I have one more question I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to turn to some of what I see in the chat. So if you've got questions, make sure you add them there. My last question is about equity, in particular racial equity. I know each of our organizations has been doing work in this space, and unfortunately, oftentimes it gets very political. So I'm kind of wondering, just kind of what are your thoughts in terms of encouragement to the community to kind of stay the course and call people in? Andy, I loved how you talked about this election is about perhaps moderation and finding what we have in common with one another rather than what we have a disagreement around. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, advice, or resources for work that you're doing in the space of racial equity with regard to workforce and CTE policy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll mention a few things. So one is at JFF, my colleague Michael Collins, one of our vice presidents, is building out a body of work around racial economic equity. And so I'd encourage folks to take a look at the resources that he and his team are putting out, which I think frame a really compelling narrative why we need to stay the course. I also think there's really interesting work funded by Gates and Bloomberg and others around their Building Equitable Pathways initiative. I think it's taking a very thoughtful approach to this. But I think from JFF's standpoint, this continues to be a time where we all need to be leaning in and having the hard conversations. And I think the more that we can advocate for the underlying data systems that help us tell the story and to speak in detail around where these equity gaps exist and why, the farther we can go. Because I think a lot of times the conversation just isn't had in a productive way that's really grounded in data. And I think the more we can get that, hopefully it can lead to more consensus and constructive momentum.
Yeah, I would agree on the data. I mean, I think part of this is we do need to start with the end first. Let's be honest, let's collect and publish the information about who is and who is not being well served by our programs currently across the board, and use that as a way for us then to start to address where the inequities are. Some of them are structural, some of them are just decisions that institutions are making that they could make different decisions. And I think that should be a part of policy. And so we're working very actively to kind of make that a greater reality across a range of different education and training investments. But I think, and I want to say, Michael Collins' work is absolutely excellent. Folks should take a look at it. We've done some work dating back years on our roadmap to racial equity, which is kind of just calling practitioners and advocates to think about where is there structural racism in the policies that we've been advocating for? How is it that it's just an issue of practices where we can be doing something differently? I think that's really important. So I think the field has something to do. I do think too, for career and technical education folks who are tuned in today, there's also a reality, which is if we diversify our classrooms, our programs, but then we're placing people in industries that don't look like the folks who are coming out of our programs, that's a challenge as well. So I do think we really do need to take seriously that this needs to be a partnership between educators and industry, between college and industry and high school and industry. So those partnership things are really important because the industries have to think differently about who their future workforce is going to be and have to think about maybe some of the different things that need to be done in addition to their training and education, like support services and other things, reorientation of supervisors to a new look of folks, new looking set of folks that are working for them now that weren't working for them before. That's a lot of the hard work that has to happen so that good programs actually are placing folks in industries that are taking that seriously as well. And so I think that's a lot of hard work that has to be done. We're doing something with our racial equity learning group where we're getting advocates and business folks to kind of talk together about kind of how it is that you can create better platforms for that to happen. And I think also too, we should just give working students, working people who are enrolled in programs a chance to talk a little bit about what would be useful for them, because I think our policy conversations tend to go past them. And it's easier for us to organize full-time students around some of these issues. It's much harder from somebody who is, holding down a full-time job, taking care of their family and taking classes to kind of participate in some of that stuff. But we as an organization are trying to make a commitment to bringing more of those folks into the discussions about the policies that we're developing and how institutions can think about how it is that they're meeting their needs in a way that's fully reflective of what they're looking for as well.
Yeah, centering learners and having authentic learner voice, not having a meeting at 10 o'clock and on a Wednesday when people are in class or working, right? Like we have a toolkit on centering learner voice and have been doing some work with the field about looking at those opportunity gaps that exist. And in fact, Perkins requires states to kind of triangulate through their comprehensive needs assessment. What are the needs of industry? Who is participating in programs and what are those program outcomes? And what's so interesting, the first set of data has just been released nationally. And while our participation data mirrors the general population, when you start to dig in, and this is the first time we've got data by career cluster, you start to see where the disparities exist in terms of who is participating in what cluster areas, and shows the pathway of the work that we have collectively to do going forward. And secondly, we find that people see gaps, but then they don't know how to talk about them. They are uncomfortable talking about them. They don't know how to identify what's the root cause of those challenges. For CTE, it's often, well, CTE is an elective, so we can't force anybody to be here, but there is more work to do there. So, all right, we've got just a couple questions here from the audience. One of them here kind of goes back to, I think, a topic we touched upon briefly is how to help the underemployed get the upgraded training needed when many have the daily task of working and taking care of a family. Realistically, what can be done to structure those experiences? Anybody have any examples they can point to?
Well, I think there's whether it's apprenticeship or just more generally work-based learning, I do think that the business community needs to recognize, they acknowledge it. Their workplaces are changing, the skills requirements are changing, just the sheer digital skills requirements of a lot of these jobs have changed dramatically over the past 2 years. I think what we need to do, and what I think CTE practitioners need to do, is to figure out how to take what they know how to do and how to put it in the workplace, right? Because I do think, to your point, Kim, that's one less place. They don't have to go to the campus if they can be learning there on site. The employer needs to make space for that to happen. They need to create time for that to happen. They need to pay people to do that stuff, but at least it's happening there on the floor or near the floor or there in the business. And I feel like that's the thing where we need to kind of move forward on that. We need policy that makes it easier for companies to do that. We need practice models that make it easier for CTE practitioners and willingness for them to actually be inserting themselves in workplaces in some way. I think that's going to be really important to help some of that. But the bottom line is we don't spend a lot on incumbent worker training, particularly not for entry-level folks, and that's where the needs are absolutely the greatest moving forward. And so that's a policy issue that I know we're all committed to working on for sure.
At JFF, we have a model called work-based courses that does a lot of what Andy just described, that we've tested through some NSF funding and now is part of one of the Department of Education EIR grants in Tennessee. And so that's, how, as Andy was saying, how do you bring what you do, but embed it within the workplace? I think there's a lot of potential for that. And I think in a good news story, we have seen companies start to step up more in terms of training their frontline workers in ways that we just didn't see 10, 15, 20 years ago. Platforms like Guild Education are doing a lot to, enable the scaling of that. But I think what worries me is that, as Andy is saying, like, we can't leave the federal government out of this. Like, I think the federal government has a really critical role to play here. And yes, we want employers to continue to increase their approaches and contributions, absolutely. But let's look and have a conversation about what is the right public-private sector role in this.
Well, I was going to do one more question, but we have 1 minute left. So I'm going to give you each a chance and give you each a magic wand and say, if you could change kind of one thing in the federal policy space and your wish were to be granted, what would it be? Andy, you want to go first?
Sure. Workforce and CTE funding should be an entitlement. Like just as we have entitlements for higher ed funding, it doesn't make sense that all those programs have to go out and scrape money together and wait for the appropriations decisions. And yet we have folks who are going to go to full-time degree programs where they know there'll be money there. It may not be enough, but know there's some money there to support what they want to do. And we're willing to run a deficit on that when the market has more demand than what Congress has guessed they're going to spend. We should be doing the same thing. We want to have a market responsive system. Those kinds of programs should be funded as entitlements as well.
Yeah.
+1 to funding. And if I had a really big magic wand, it would be the creation of a truly learner and worker centered lifelong learning system that really brings together the best of what we have now and starts to create and design things that maybe we haven't even thought of yet, but really kind of moving us away from legacy systems and moving more boldly towards the future.
Well, thank you both for taking time out of what I know are very busy schedules. Appreciate your leadership of the organizations, the collaboration across our organizations. Still lots of work to do together, and I'm grateful to have each of you as peers in this space. And thank you for your time to all of our attendees. If you would please give us your feedback by filling out the brief evaluation. We welcome feedback at Advanced CTE, and we'll endeavor to make adjustments in our next time that we gather. So thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great holiday season. Bye now.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
Bye, Andy.
Bye, Maria.